Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Textile Group AGM. So my name is Elizabeth Ann. I'm a member of the committee and I'm going to be your webinar host today. So I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping tips and then hand over to Anne French, our chair. So just a reminder, if there are any issues with Wi-Fi, please just rejoin using the same link. So we'll just go through a few webinar tips. So please do interact with each other using the chat function because obviously you can't talk in person, but please do use that. And then when it comes to questions, please use the Q&A box because then it's much easier to keep track of them. Otherwise, if they're in the chat, we might lose them. And finally, just a note about your view options. You can fit to window. And later on, when we're having the speakers, you might like to actually have side-by-side speaker view. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to our Textile Group Chair, Anne French.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our AGM for 2020, which is again via Zoom. Thank you all for attending. And I, for one, did not think we would be doing this virtually again for another year. We've had no apologies, but we have had an excellent response to coming along virtually. You should have received our AGM agenda via iConnect, but it's going to go onto the screen just in case you haven't. Our minutes for last year's AGM were made available on our website, and I hope you've all had time to read them, or you could go back after this to read them. I'm now going to move on to my chair's report. For all of us, it's been a year that none of us have ever experienced. If the group committee is anything to go by, we've worked from home, we've been on furlough, we've reduced our hours to make savings for our employers, we've been restructured, and some have even been made redundant. We cannot be unusual for our sector. We've had to take all our committee meetings online and all our activities also. It's been an incredibly steep learning curve, and which may not be obvious to all of those of you who are watching us online, it's just as much work for the committee. I have to thank them all, and all those who have also supported us by giving papers, lectures, participating in conversations, and even delivering workshops. Never did it become so apparent that one has to have a really brilliant broadband connection. Thank you also to those who returned the questionnaire following last year's AGM. It was hugely helpful, even if we couldn't implement all the suggestions immediately thanks to the pandemic. And as ever, we really welcome feedback of any kind. And we will be sending out another questionnaire after this AGM, which Emily, our secretary, will tell you more about shortly. But it's about why volunteering to serve on the committee is not as competitive as it could be. Because while we have replacements for those who are leaving this year, which includes myself, all the committee positions have been uncontested. And I'd really just like to say that serving on the committee in any role is hugely, hugely rewarding at any point in one's career, whether you're at the beginning, the middle, or towards the end. Despite having worked in conservation for a while now, I have learned and benefited so much over the last 3 years, which is all due to the stimulation and experiences brought to the committee by its members. So I'd like to thank them all. It's been a great journey. We're also going to hear later from Icon, from Michael Nellis, our membership officer, and Sara Crofts, our CEO, about the work that they've been carrying on our behalf. Then after this short AGM, we're going to hear again how some have fared during this last year. The culture and heritage sector is still suffering deeply, and I look forward to hearing how others have been dealing with this economic depression for us all. I personally suspect the pandemic has brought changes that mean some aspects of our work will never return as they were. As well as COVID, last year also brought new political and cultural activism to our sector. And my own employer must be typical in that it is now prioritising addressing the issues raised of access, diversity, decolonisation, de-accessioning and repatriation of collections. These activities must include conservators and conservation as attitudes to the value and meaning of the material culture of heritage shifts. And I wonder, as a thought as I leave the committee, whether these shifts may be as transformative as the pandemic in the long run. Thank you all.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Just quickly, a summary of our finances for the last financial year. Emily, I don't know, have you put my first slide on? Yes, you have, thank you. The biggest change is that we have saved in excess of £1,000 in committee costs due to all our communications having been through email, Zoom and WhatsApp. Apart from that, there isn't an awful lot to report. As you know, most events we ran over the last year were cost-free because they were all held online, and therefore fees for venue and expense of catering all fell away. The only chargeable event we held was our 3-day pattern making course, which cost us £2,700 to put on, but we raised £3,394.02 for ticket sales, giving us a profit of nearly £700. The other transactions that pop up are a refund for a deposit on catering, which would have gone towards last year's forum, but which was cancelled due to COVID. This sum was £192. We also paid £21.96 to cover the cost of fabric used by Heather Porter for the face coverings she very kindly made. Can I have the next slide, please? The transactions that relate to this current financial year are our income from the carpet webinar, which came to £321.86, and the ticket sales for our forum. The income from the forum is split into 4 different lots relating to the 4 days over which it ran. The total for this was £793.96. We also received our income from membership fees of £1,000, as we do every year, except in the past this would have been higher. Icon have now standardized the amount to make it fairer across groups. The big change, as I mentioned last year, is that Icon's new finance system has come into use. This means that all transactions are now set up via the new iComplete system rather than through our group bank account. It also means that any balance in excess of a £2,000 float is skimmed off at the end of each month. Though if we tell Icon that we need a larger amount, for example, to pay the event costs for the pattern making course, they will transfer money into our account, so we're in a position to make those payments. Icon are mostly just interested that we budget our events to either break even or make a profit, which we have been and are doing consistently, so we're in a good place. Thank you.
Hello. Just to move on to the Secretary's report. Okay. Just a point to start with, as Anne mentioned, the AGM minutes from last year will be on the website. That's on the Textile Group page in the documents section, and we'll also be uploading this year's to the same section, so you can view them there. So moving on to the Textile Group committee member elections this year, as Anne said, each of the positions was uncontested. It's great that we did get one person for each position, but we don't need to go to a formal vote. We just need to ask members to agree to these positions being filled as they are. An iConnect email went out last Thursday with the statements from the nominees for these positions, but it may not have reached everyone. We've heard that not everyone may have had the email, so I'm very sorry if you weren't able to see the statements ahead of time. What we'll do is we'll put those up onto the committee webpage as part of the Textile Group, so you can view the full statements there. And I'll just do a very brief, I'm afraid, intro to each of the nominees just now, and then we'll go into the poll. So just to so about the poll first. It will be a live poll which pops up on the screen as a box, and we'll just ask members only, if that's okay, no non-members to vote, to just select yes or no for each of the nominees to say if you agree or not agree. So first of all, it's Ksenia Marco for chair. Ksenia has over 40 years experience of caring for textile collections at the V&A, the National Trust, and most recently following retirement as a freelance consultant, and remains very active in the profession. Marina Rodriguez for treasurer. Marina has been based in the UK since 2018 and has been a textile conservator at Textile Conservation Studio Limited, Bristol since early 2020. Previously, Marina has experience as a company director and has lots of transferable skills for financial management. We've got Beth Gillians for secretary. Beth is a current second-year student at the University of Glasgow, studying on the Textile Conservation MPhil course, and has been engaged with the Textile Group for many years, and will be speaking later today, actually, as part of our talks following the AGM. We've got Melinda Hay for the Emerging Professionals representative. Melinda graduated in 2019, completing a graduate diploma and MA courses in conservation of cultural heritage. Melinda is currently working in private practice on a variety of projects, including the collection at Burley House. And last but not least, Anya Golubielska for events officer. Anya graduated with an MA in textile conservation in 2014 from the Academy of Arts in Warsaw, and then went on to move to the UK in 2015 to join Zenzi Tinker Conservation in Brighton, where she has remained ever since, working on a wide variety of studio-based and on-site conservation projects. So if we could have the poll up now and give everybody a chance to vote, that would be great. Just while we give a minute for everyone just to fill in their answers there, I'd just like to say the other changes in the committee are those stepping down, which includes Anne French as chair, Kim Thusing as treasurer, myself as secretary, and Viola Nicastro as events officer. So just to say thank you to those stepping down. Other changes are Maria Pardos Mansilla will be moving from events officer into an events technical role, and Kelly Grimshaw will be stepping down from the emerging professionals representative role, but will be staying with the committee as a co-opted member on the events team for the next year as well. And then my final point was just to mention the survey that Anne talked about earlier, which we're hoping to send out not too long after the AGM, just to gauge sort of response and interest into joining the committee. As Anne said, we don't always have an overwhelming response, and it would just be good to hear directly from the members about ways that you know, it could be more inviting to join the committee, or things that might be stopping them, or you know, if there's anything we can do really. So please look out for that and please fill it out. We'll make sure it's not too long or arduous, but it'd be great to hear some responses from people. Elizabeth Ann, how are we getting on with the poll? Is it ready?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think probably we've been steady on 56 out of 69 people. So I think that probably means we should end the poll, because I think maybe some people are not members. Okay. Okay, I'll end it. It's 100% for everybody.
Okay, thank you for voting, everyone. I'll stop my report now and we can move on to...
Afternoon all. Just move to the next slide, please, Emily. So in March 2021, we originally had planned a 2-day in-person event for students and emerging professionals. However, due to COVID, like so many other events, the committee had to rethink logistics and consider taking the event online. We felt that it was still important to provide something for the students and emerging professionals, even if it wasn't what was originally planned. Therefore, we asked the speakers who had originally agreed to take part in person whether they'd be willing to give a shortened snippet of their planned talks or give a talk which reflected the effects of COVID-19. Luckily, several speakers agreed, and we had the start of our new online event. To ensure people weren't zoomed out, we held the event over 2 Thursday evenings, 1 week apart, and we also encouraged participants to join us for the Needle and Thread virtual pub afterwards to network. Each event was a success, with 144 attendees on the first session and 95 on the second. We are still planning to host an in-person event, ideally in 2022, similar to what was planned initially, but we are waiting to see what happens with in-person events to ensure that we are able to give an event which will deliver on expectations. That's all from me, so I will hand over to Terry, who will cover Icon News.
Hello. Hello. Hello, I'm Terry. Since the last AGM, there have been a great number of you who have taken time to contribute to Icon News, despite the limitations that COVID has brought about. So thank you very much. Here are a few examples of textile or textile conservation related contributions that have been made over the last year. Here is a couple of images taken from Icon News of some fabulous book reviews that were given by Mariah Jordan and Alison Lister. Next slide, please, Emily. Also, it was fabulous to hear from the students, the most recent graduates from the Glasgow course. They basically introduced themselves to the industry and talked about their dissertation topics, so that was brilliant. Next slide, please, Emily. We've also had lots of reviews. So we had a review of the pattern cutting online workshop that was given by Leah Warren-Award, and also a review of lots of online conferences. And it's also always really great to hear from practical working conservators about case studies. So we had a brilliant one from Emma Telford. So that's just little snippets here. Next slide, please. And then just 2 more things that I've pulled out from the Icon News. So a lovely review of an online talk that was written by Ksenia. And also we heard from Alison Lister of her experience applying for to the Cultural Recovery Fund. So they're just a few examples of some of the brilliant contributions we've had. Next slide, please, Emily. So just basically more, please, for next year. Obviously, as we start to do things slightly more out and about again, there might be more chances to write, and yeah, be grateful to receive those. So please get in touch with me. And there's some dates on the slide here just to say when the next copy deadlines are coming up. So any ideas or any thoughts, just get in touch with me or just send them straight to Lynette Gill. Thank you so much. I will hand over to the next person, who I believe is Hannah.
Yeah, hello. So I run our social media, which for us means the Twitter and the Facebook. These have both continued to grow over the last year, and we're regularly getting kind of thousands of impressions. An impression is just when anybody sees anything that we've posted. I noted last year, and it's been the kind of same again this year, that our Facebook is generally people that are more likely to actually be members. And then the Twitter, we quite often are engaging with other professional bodies. So that might be other groups of Icon, international groups like AIC, or it could be the training institutions. So like the CTC in Glasgow have recently got onto Twitter. I'm also trying to engage a bit more with potential funders. So when funding bodies post that they have opened applications for different pots of money or different scholarship opportunities, I'm also trying to make sure that we get those out to our membership. Over the last year, the social media officers have really been supported by lots of regular meetings with Icon head office. So that's been looking at trying to really kind of get our umbrella message across all the groups and looking at getting a social media strategy in place. The different officers within each group have a kind of a chat, and so we've been making sure that we know what's going on so we can share relevant events or just information that might be interesting to members of different groups. I'm also really keen to just share what you guys are up to. So if you've seen an event that you want to let other people know about, or maybe you are involved in something, or even if you've just got an interesting project, If you email me, I can normally get something online pretty quickly. And then if you know about it further into the future, maybe let me and Terry know, and we can kind of help you share that out. There have been some changes to the Icon website with this kind of new website that's come out. So while I'm still making changes, something that I'd like you to do for me is to just make sure that you've ticked the Icon Textile Group as your first choice, because that will mean that you do get all our Iconex. And if anyone missed any of these Iconex about the AGM, it might be that you haven't double checked your preferences. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to the events team.
So the committee actually had a very full programme of in-person events planned. However, we quickly realised we needed to adapt to the changing situation. And thanks really must go to the Book and Paper Group, who led the way with their hugely successful Conservation Together at Home webinar series. And their committee actually provided training for us in running a webinar, and they helped us, and we were able to launch our first online event, which was last year's AGM. With pandemic tops, and so that went really well, and it encouraged us to move forward. And one thing that we realized with a webinar, there's not so much chance to interact with people, so we introduced the Needle and Thread, which is our virtual pub, and that was an opportunity for members to chat to each other, particularly after webinar events. And then in the summer, we started our In Conversation evening lecture series, and we had Ksenia Marco in conversation with Alison Lister to mark the publication of the Woven Tapestry Guidelines for Conservation book. And then in December, we had Sheila Landy reflecting on her career, and that was in conversation with Anne French. And another lecture which we had was in February, and this was really a kind of precursor to an in-person course that we hope that we will be able to run once COVID restrictions are completely lifted. And that was on-site cleaning methodologies applied to 2 historic carpets at Felbrigg Hall in Norfolk. And that was presented by Ksenia Marco and Glyn Charnock. So we actually have had a go at doing some practical events via Zoom. And the first of these was a face covering workshop that was very kindly led by Heather Porter. And she actually wrote instructions which are on the website as well too. So we were quite encouraged by the fact that we were able to do something practical online. So Maria's going to talk about these Alison co-workshops.
Yeah, so in addition to the face covering workshop, during the months of October to December, we had the group ran a series of cotton pattern workshops taught by a mother and daughter duo, Alison and Co. And the attendants had the option to book both in either individual lessons or the block of 3 sessions. And with the way we will learn the theory and practical techniques on pattern cutting, draping, or tool making. And it had quite positive feedback, and especially we want to thank both or, well, 3 of the brave lecturers. Then they put themselves forward for being the first ones to do these kind of things, and all the attendants who embraced the online workshops and went for it. So next slide.
So then our major event for 2021 was our joint Spring Forum with the Historic Interiors Group. And this is something which we had actually advertised and done a call for paper prior to the lockdown. So the theme was conservation out in the open, the challenges of displaying and conserving textiles in open display. And we were a bit more experienced with using Zoom by this time, so we were a bit worried about Zoom fatigue. So we decided to do this over 4 afternoons and to break it with the weekend. And we actually had 19 presentations, so a combination of full papers and shorter posters. And we also had 2 needle and thread events following on from the meetings for people to have a chat about the papers afterwards. So we had well over 100 people for each of those sessions, and we had progressed a bit by then, and we've actually recorded everything, and Maria's done a great job of editing, and they're actually available now on the Icon's YouTube channel. And we also have all the preprints available on the Icon website, and you'll find those in the Textile Group pages.
So on regard of the future events, we are currently planning the program for this year. In September, we will have Working in Private Practice, a conversation between Ceci Tinker and Sara Glenn, exploring the particulars of working in the private sector. So if you have any questions or issues you would like them to raise during this event, please do get in touch with any of us, so we make sure that will get through. This event is part of In Conversation, in the Conversation series, and we aiming to carry on with this format in the future. To help keeping connected, we want to also continue with the Needle and Thread virtual pub for attend to social gatherings, after events, and webinars. Once it's safe to do so, we are hoping to proceed with the in-person carpet conservation workshop that we aimed to do last year, but obviously COVID. And this workshop is run by Cassini Marco and Gleb Charnock, and will take place in the National Trust property Blinking Hall in Norfolk. We are also hoping to add to the program a visit to the Derby-based Heritage Trimming Limited and the Museum of Making. And as always, all the details will be sent via Iconet at the correct time. So we're looking into different subjects and collaboration with different groups for future events. But we are very open to ideas for future events. So if you have any ideas, any feedback, any project you're working on you would like to share with us, please do get in touch, because we're just always happy to hear from you. So you can get in touch by the email address is on the screen right now, or you can email to any members of the committee, and our addresses are on the Icon website. Thank you.
We were hoping to hear from Michael Nellis about the state of our membership, but unfortunately he's not been able to make it. So instead we'll move on to any other business, and if anyone has any questions, please put them into the Q&A, and we'll just give you a few minutes to do that. And if there is no any other business, then that concludes our AGM. I can't see any questions, but please feel free to add them in the Q&A box over the next half hour or so, and the committee will do their best to answer them at the end. And we're now going to move on to what we've called Another Year On, Reflecting on the Pandemic. And this was rooted in our AGM last year, where it was very early on in the pandemic, in hindsight, that we asked various people across the textile conservation sector to reflect on what they were doing and how they were doing, to let us all know what was going on. And what we did is we sent them all a standard list of questions to speak to, so that we could get a kind of unified picture. And when it came to planning this AGM, and we realised that we were still probably sitting at home or at work on Zoom participating in an AGM, that it would be great to hear from the same people all over again. And they have kindly and agreed to do that. And they're all going to tell us how they are 1 year on. And our first speaker to that is Joanne Hackett, who is now at the Centre for Textile Conservation in Glasgow.
Hello again. I'm Joanne Hackett. Until May of 2021, I was the section leader in textile and fashion conservation at the V&A, managing the studio and work programme for a team of 9 conservators and 6 costume mounting specialists. However, in June 2021, I took up the post of lecturer in textile conservation at the University of Glasgow, joining Karen Thompson and Sara teaching on the MPhil programme. Well, it was quite a year, wasn't it? Worse than we could have imagined when we talked about the effects of COVID at the meeting last year. On a personal note, my prediction of job losses in the sector proved prescient. I noted last year that during the first lockdown, all but 5 of the 50 conservation staff at the V&A were furloughed. Of those 5 who worked at home on essential projects, 4 were made redundant, including myself. The V&A lost approximately 20% of its staff since last year, following a series of departmental restructures, done in a bid to close a £10 million funding deficit predicted this year, next year, and the year after. Many of those posts were reduced by voluntary means, either by people reducing their hours, taking early retirement, voluntary redundancies, or unpaid sabbaticals. In many cases, it was the most senior and long-serving staff who chose to leave, as the redundancy package was most favourable to staff with long service. Some have gone on to other posts already, and some have chosen to launch private practice or to concentrate in on existing private practice. I remember being really gloomy last year about the job prospects for recent graduates, but in fact, I think this loss of staff at the top of many museum organisations will lead to a trickle-up effect, with junior staff being hired to fill the gaps left by the retirees. As of last week, the V&A was advertising 5 different roles across the conservation department at various levels. This picture has been similar, if not quite so bad, in the other national museums. The Museums Association Redundancy Tracker has a running total of 4,184 redundancies across the UK heritage sector as of July the 1st this year. And it will be really interesting to see what happens when the furlough scheme ends on September 30th. During the first lockdown, the collections were monitored using remote systems. The climate systems could be monitored remotely, and insect monitoring was done in accessible areas by security staff who were on site. However, we found on returning to the museum in July and August of last year that there had been a moth outbreak in one set of galleries that required extensive cleaning and freezing work. At one point as well, during a really hot spell of weather, a conservator, a technician and a curator had to travel into the museum to take a wax sculpture off display as temperature monitoring equipment in the gallery indicated that it was in danger of softening. Returning to the museum involved extensive reorganisation of the space to allow for social distancing, and given the size of the team in textiles, a rota of on-site working was established, with approximately half the team working on site from Monday to Wednesday and half from Thursday to Saturday. This allowed us to maintain 2 working cohorts without an overlap to reduce the risk of passing COVID between the 2 teams. Bottles of sanitizer were deployed around the studio at commonly shared equipment such as the iron, and working from home was encouraged, and the teams working on priority gallery projects were given priority on site. So staff returned to work in stages depending on which exhibition projects they were working on, and with everybody back on site for at least part of the week by November. Working in the galleries on exhibition installations proved a challenge as social distancing was hard to maintain, especially in tight areas with large objects. The pace of the exhibition installs for Wonderland and for Epic Around were deliberately stretched out over several months to allow for smaller on-site workforce. Normally those exhibitions would be installed in a 3-week period, and they were taking 2 or 3 months instead. This only really could happen because the museum was shut again from October to March, or whenever it was it reopened. Courier trips have been seriously cut back, with the vast majority now being done remotely. And I think this policy will continue post-pandemic, as it represents a huge cost saving to venues and a huge staff time saving for the lender. There will be exceptions for particularly difficult items. So a notable case being with the Devonshire hunting tapestries that were recently lent to Chatsworth, and the installation personally supervised by Francis Hartog. Thankfully, the V&A was not scheduled to take a summer placement last year, but sadly, the planned summer placement for this summer had to be modified to a virtual placement on the insistence of the head of conservation and our safety advisor. Elizabeth Ann could possibly talk about how this is going to work and how this worked. Maybe Karen can talk about how this worked last year with the second year students now. I think the most positive aspect of all this disruption is the move towards hybrid conference attendance, with some online attendance becoming the norm from now on. I think this will massively boost outreach and accessibility, and has to be a good thing, not least in terms of the carbon footprint for attending conferences several thousand miles away from where you're based. Likewise, the increased frequency and availability of online talks and seminars hosted by organisations like Icon, I hope that will continue. I think that's one of the great positives. That and blended working, where people will be able to work partly from home from now on. This was always resisted quite strongly in the V&A in collections division, but now will be, I think, an accepted way to move forward. And I think that's all I have to say at the moment. So I think I'm feeling more optimistic than I was a year ago, but it's still not a happy place.
And we'll now move on to Mika Takami of Historic Royal Palaces.
Hello everyone, it's very nice to see you all again at this AGM, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to share an update from the Textile Conservation Studio at Hampton Court Palace. Those who don't know me, and I lead a team of 11 textile conservators and another team of conservators of different media or material specialism, and I also manage the Textile Conservation Studio at Hampton Court Palace. Firstly, as we all recognize, what an extraordinary year this has been. We had lockdowns, and it was so against the grain for us to close our palaces, not only to our visitors, but also to ourselves. The closure of our sites meant that the staff also had no access to our studio, and this continued until January this year. It's been a very strange time for all of us. And almost all the conservators in our conservation collection care team has been on furlough over the pandemic period, supporting the organization. During the site closure periods, only the head of the department and a few preventive conservators have remained at work, carrying out regular condition checks and also other essential collection care work at each site. We've got 6 sites at each site to protect and safeguard our collection. The pandemic has had a severe impact on historic royal palaces. With repeated lockdowns, sites closures, we lost 90% of our income. As a result, during the past year, HRP took the difficult decision of shrinking the organization by just over 40%. This meant also to our studio, our textile conservation team, shrinking by 35%, which means we are now a team of 11 conservators instead of 14 conservators previously. We also all have reduced our working hours to support the financial recovery of our organization. While being on furlough for such a long time, we've been missing our palaces, collections, work, and colleagues. It's been a challenging year, not having access that we normally have and not having colleagues around we normally have. But we kept sharing news and other updates or information at our regular catch-up team meetings. We held virtually weekly up through to near Christmas, and then in January, fortnightly. And we also kept in touch by emails, as well as WhatsApp messaging, sharing any useful publications or videos that you watched on YouTube or webinars and more. We also received the latest news and discussions from the preventive team and also conservation science team and their communities, and as well as that of collection management through our monthly all team meetings. During the pandemic and going through the difficult time last year, however, a huge amount has been going on behind the closed doors and behind the scenes. A number of building conservation projects have continued since last summer with external funding, namely the Cultural Recovery Fund or Rescue Fund, administered by Historic England. This funding was absolutely crucial for our historical palaces, and it has enabled us to ensure that the palaces are protected, safe, and secure. HRP have also hosted Christmases, Easter Lynch palaces. We also have done many filming events. We also hosted a food festival, and last week, the Garden Festival at Hampton Court Palace, previously known as Flower Show. And more feature filming will be taking place in the coming months at Hampton Court. So as we emerge from the shadow of the pandemic, we textile conservators began returning to work on a flexi furlough basis from January. And the Textile Conservation Studio at Hampton Court also reopened in late March, although for the time being only partially, not the whole 2 floors that we have in the studio. And since March, we've been very busy carrying out essential audits and the treatment work for the most vulnerable textile, furnishing textile collection on display towards the reopening of our palaces in May. And also the conserving and mounting objects, adapting costume mannequins, and supporting press photography and filming for the opening or reopening of the new exhibitions, such as the new fashion exhibition, Royal Fashion in the Making, which opened on the 3rd of June in Orangery at Kensington Palace, the fantastic Tudor art exhibition of Gold Glory exhibition at Hampton Court, and the reopening of the Kew Palace with the new exhibition of George III, The Mind Behind the Myth. We also have had the treatment object mounting work for new loans, and we tried and gained some experience with installing and deinstalling a loan object remotely as a lender or as a borrower to save costs on courier trips, as George just mentioned earlier. And I believe that this practice will continue post-pandemic. At the same time, we also began the detailed condition assessment and surface cleaning of large-scale objects, such as tapestries, stage beds and canopies in May, and we will continue with this work over the coming months. A little bit more about the new dimension of our work as we emerge from the pandemic. Although this might be possibly temporary, but we are encouraged and prompted to make greater use of in-house skills rather than sourcing externally. So one of the good examples is that we made the costume toiles, 5 of them, to go on display at this new fashion exhibition at Kensington Palace. We also made the unveiling cross for a statue, which had a ceremony recently, as you might remember, in the Sunken Garden at Kensington Palace. And also utilizing our different background during the conservation training. Some of us also contributed to the condition assessment of the non-textile objects such as paper based or advising on mounting and framing of non-textile objects for the exhibition. I'm very happy to report that we have had one textile conservation intern, Daisy Graham, who had been put on furlough when the pandemic began. But she was able to come back when the HRP was able to extend her contract by the same length as she was put on furlough. And she returned to continue her hands-on work from January, working on costume objects for the upcoming exhibition, and stayed with us until the end of April this year, working alongside the experienced conservators in person in studio. Currently, we are still on flex furlough and work for a pre-approved number of days for the targeted specific tasks and projects. We also come in and work in the studio in rota, whilst undertaking desk-based work at home where possible. to maintain the COVID safe level of people working in this workroom at the same time. It's going to be some time before we are all back fully, but it's the moment where we start really looking forward and looking ahead to the future now. The gardens have been open since April. The palace is open since May, although currently on a 5-day per week basis, used to be 7 days a week. As the organization, we have begun to get back on our feet. We can feel that, and which is just wonderful. In the meantime, we continue in tandem with the preventive conservator colleagues to keep the collection safe, and while we're transitioning through to what we hope will be closer to a state of normality come the autumn. And going forward, whilst we reform and resume our general treatment program, we continue supporting new exhibitions and loans. We have busy exhibition plans well into 2023. We also have had the success with the application to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, AHRC, Capability for Collection Funds, which is called CAPCO Fund. HRP received nearly £1 million to renew and upgrade our scientific research facilities in our Heritage Science Laboratory at Hampton Court Palace. We are very proud to say that we now have got a new state-of-the-art science laboratory, including a scanning electron microscope, portable X-ray fluorescence, portable Fourier FTIR, and HPLC, new Xeno machine, light aging chamber, 3D laser scanner, and so on. This upgrade will transform our ability to undertake detailed analysis of objects on their condition, materials, and manufacturing technique. We are very, very excited about this. And I'd like to end my update with a few very happy news. 2 of our colleagues, textile conservators from our team, achieved to become Icon ACRs last month. They did rise to the challenge to prepare and present all the assessment materials digitally and hosted the PACR second stage assessment day virtually. This was the time when we had very limited access to our studio. It involved an enormous amount of effort on their part, and I'm very pleased for them to have achieved this brilliant outcome. We also celebrated the arrival of 2 babies, and also 1 wedding finally went ahead after the restriction was lifted. And then we expect another baby on its way in October. Last but not the least, I am absolutely delighted to report this, that our funders have just agreed to revise to the revised program and the funding schedule for the Textile Conservation Internship, which we have been hosting over the past 11 years. And a 12-month funded internship at Hampton Court will recommence from September 22. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Our next contribution will come from Mariah Jordan, who heads up the National Trust Conservation Studios at Alton in Norfolk.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to give you an update from the National Trust. As we all have, we've had quite a year in every organisation and in every studio. When COVID took off last year, the National Trust was faced with loss of cash flow, basically, and completely closed down everything to a skeleton staff at properties, in regional offices and at the centre. And the studio was closed while the National Trust took maximum, made maximum use of the furlough scheme. Although they never, in fact, used the part-time furlough option. So I was furloughed. It seemed like forever at the time, but in fact, it was 3 months. because then I was brought back because we were about to start with this slimming down the organisation by 20%. During that time, I made a lot of noise about how crucial we were, but that it was also, as a national facility, it was difficult for our regional office to take where I was managed, to take a decision on behalf of the whole of the National Trust. And that was listened to, and so we were put sideways and told that we would be considered at a later part of the consultation period. So that was very fortunate for us. It bought us a bit of time. And in the meantime, I worked with the operational risk and the business continuity groups and fundraising. And between all of us managed to work out a safe working mechanism to bring people back on project basis. And so by September, we had the first of the team coming back, 4 at a time. And we worked, made sure that we worked on the 2-meter working rule, and we were divided into 2 bubbles to keep us, to minimize the risks if indeed any of us were exposed to COVID. I'm glad to say that everybody was back by the end of October, and we've been functioning ever since in that way. However, while that was all going on, we did have the what was called in the National Trust the reset of the National Trust, the slimming down by 20%. And that some people took retirement, just as Joe was saying at the V&A. Some people took voluntary redundancies. Some people were made redundant after they were pooled in a group of people. And other roles were amalgamated. And so, for example, we had Ksenia's role, where she had been both the national advisor and the studio manager, had been given 2 full-time roles, and that was amalgamated again. And so I'm now doing both those roles, as Ksenia did before 2016. That's a sadness, but and I'm sure when things pick up again, those roles will be divided again. But for the time being, there's no money, and therefore those amalgamations have been done. However, as we all know, in the legislation requires there to be 45 days of consultation. And I'm glad to say that some of the areas that we asked the National Trust to look at, they were proposing to amalgamate 3 posts, 2 for preventive conservation and our scientist, into 1 role. And through research, we were able to persuade the National Trust that we needed a minimum of 2. So we only lost 1 post instead of 2. So there were some gains, not as many as we would want, of course, but one of the major things was the head of conservation was proposed to be downgraded, and we were able to show that that would be disastrous if she were downgraded, and that wasn't done in the end. So it was very uncomfortable for all of us, as I know it's been across the whole of the industry. I would say we have been amazingly fortunate. And part of that has been because we were extremely lucky to, with fundraising, with our fundraising colleagues, we were able to raise money for conservation, remedial conservation. The losses that we did get was that our intern, who had just finished her 2-year internship, looked as if she was going to go. I managed to extend it by the 6 months that she was on furlough for, but she wasn't able to work with us for another year. And we weren't able to backfill for maternity. We had no visits to the studio this year, and we've not been able to offer any student placements. So those are all great sadnesses for us, and we have lost our internship completely. We've not managed to find funding to replace that, though I'm working very hard with fundraising to try and do it. So we've managed to stay open throughout the second lockdown of January, February and March. We did only work 6 people in the studio at a time, again for protection and because it was felt that it was so virulent. We did run out of some things for people to do at home, and therefore we had 3 people who were furloughed for up to 2 weeks. But that's all. Otherwise, we managed to keep going, which has been brilliant. We've been getting objects completed and back to the properties and returning them to display in time for opening up the properties. And we've also managed to get new projects from properties back to us. So it's been difficult, and there have been quite a lot of changes in order to achieve that, including things like helping people remotely to take tapestries down at the properties and helping them to get them packed to send them to us. We've done remote condition surveys, and we've also used a lot. We've been involved with press to provide sort of good news, good feeling stories after we had so much negative press around the Black Lives Matter, slavery and colonialism. The National Trust came in for a lot of flack over that, and that's been, but conservation and all that we can contribute to that has been used to offer our members and visitors a feeling that it is worth still supporting the National Trust. As I say, one of our big things has been fundraising, and the Royal Oak Foundation, you may have seen in the press, gave us an amazingly generous present for our 125th birthday, which was last year. And that's been £3 million for conservation of collections over a 5-year period, part of which will come to us, but the majority will go to the Decorative Arts Studio at Knoll. So that has been really extraordinary to keep us going. It is solely, though, for conservation within the studios. We've kept in touch with our colleagues through Icon, who's done a fantastic job. Thank you so much, the Textile Group, for keeping us all in touch with each other. I think looking further ahead, how will we see this period and what impact will it have for the National Trust? Well, we work on a devolved model, and I think that devolved model will continue. There have been some changes, but by and large, it will continue. Properties will continue to need conservation to be done and will commission work in their small ways with regional conservators, but we need our cash flow to be re-established, and then we can resume. But in the meantime, we're entirely dependent on fundraising. And I have to say our fundraising department are working 24/7 to help us to raise money to look after the collection. So that's where we are, and we're hoping so much to be able through that to offer our internship again, and for next year offering work placements, because we miss seeing people and we miss sharing our knowledge and our the conservation of our projects with a wider audience. And there is, although we're doing filming and we're doing, we do Instagram, all the other things, there's no substitute for seeing people and working with people. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Alison Lister of Textile Conservation Limited in Bristol.
Thank you, Anne. Hello, everyone, and thank you to the committee for inviting me back to speak today. So I'm the owner and director of Textile Conservation Limited, which is a fully independent conservation studio based in Bristol. The studio undertakes mainly interventive conservation work for a wide range of clients in the public and private sectors, from large heritage organisations down to individual owners of individual artefacts. And before lockdown, before the COVID pandemic, I headed a team of 4 permanently employed conservators, one of which is myself. So the business employs me. So even though I'm an owner, it also employs me. And we had a very healthy work schedule for the coming months. So things were looking quite positive. The immediate impact of the COVID pandemic was postponement and even cancellation of planned work. So our work schedule essentially went haywire. We were able to continue with projects that were already in the studio, and we did try to manage that through a 7-day rota system to reduce the number of people in the studio at any one time. However, once the schools closed, it wasn't possible for at least one of my colleagues to be available. And in the end, maintaining this rota system just didn't seem to work. Also, the input of new work slowed significantly. It didn't stop altogether because we do have a very broad range of clients, but it really slowed down. So things were getting really very tricky financially, as well as actually managing the health and safety aspect of it. So what I did was I furloughed half of the team. I didn't furlough myself. I didn't feel I could just walk away from the business and leave it to its own devices. And I couldn't actually furlough my 4th colleague because she had not been on the payroll for long enough. So the 2 of us just carried on working together within the studio. It's 1,000 square feet, so it's possible to maintain safe working distances. And in fact, we almost created our own little bubble. We both lived near the studio, so we're able to walk in. It was a very quiet route, so we felt actually we were just as safe here as we might have been at home or anywhere else. There were no clients coming in, and we didn't do any work outside of the studio for the lockdown. But obviously that changed a little bit as the restrictions eased a bit. What we turned our attention to as the work reduced, my colleague Marina Herridges, who was mentioned earlier as the new treasurer, we put more effort into developing a new marketing strategy, seeking and applying for funds, and exploring new future income streams that we might be able to develop. And I think, as anyone who works for themselves knows, no work does not mean not working. You put your time and effort into other things, into finding other ways to support yourself and your business, because if there is no work, there is no income and you have no livelihood. So we put our efforts into trying to find new clients, in maintaining as far as we could the current client and supplier relationships. We are part of a whole network of people who rely on us, and also looking at ways to try and reduce our overheads so that we could save a little bit money, including not paying ourselves the full salaries. By September, the 2 previously furloughed colleagues had decided to leave the studio. They were not made redundant. Other opportunities came up which they chose to pursue. But I didn't fill their posts again immediately, and that's because really there was not the financial means to do that. As the restrictions have eased, some of the cancelled and postponed projects have been reinstated and have come back to us, which has been really good news. And new work has come in, and certainly in the last 3 months, there's been a steady increase in inquiries and commissions. So actually, we can see we're moving towards a much healthier future in terms of work. The business did receive some financial support through the rates system, which really helped cover the costs of running the premises. And I felt it was really important that if nothing else, I hung on to this space. It's very expensive to set up a studio. It's even expensive to close down a studio. And the idea of having to start again later was just a no-no. So I put all my effort into preserving the premises. And as you saw earlier, the studio also got a £25,000 grant from the Cultural Recovery Fund for Heritage, and another £500 grant, sorry, £5,000 grant from a local grant fund to support growth in local businesses. And those funds have been used partly to cover some of the overheads, but also to release a bit of our time to develop these new marketing efforts and to look at income streams. But we were also able to upgrade some key equipment and to look to other ways of marketing our services and providing our services to new clients. I have to say it was a big boost in confidence to get that funding, and that's why I wanted to write about it, because I think, although it's very small compared to the figures that some of the previous speakers have been talking about, we are a tiny business, and I think I just felt it was important to show that even as a tiny business, you should be going for whatever support and help is available, and you can receive that money. It can come your way. So it was a big boost in confidence and a real sort of clear signal to us that what we did was worthwhile. All of the above has obviously kept the business going, which is very helpful, and it's really eased the strain somewhat. It has also had the effect of making me rethink the business, how I want it to be in the future. It's very true that necessity is the mother of invention, and I think we have put our thinking caps on and really tried to consider what more we could do with the expertise and the resources that we have. In terms of keeping in touch, I have made an effort, probably more than before, to touch base with colleagues and clients and suppliers, and I'm very grateful to those people who've also reached out to me to see how I was doing and to see how we could help each other through this difficult time. I wanted to connect, not just to commiserate about how difficult things were being, but also to begin to explore new ways of working, perhaps in a more collaborative way, with other private studios, with other freelancers, with other small business owners, because I think COVID really exposed the vulnerability of self-employment. But it does also show its strengths and show what could be achieved with just a little bit more exposure and attention. And COVID really did shine a light, I think, on the situation of people who work for themselves in whatever area. And I think the benefits of establishing networks has become, ever more obvious, and of using those to really support new areas of work or ways of working that could have seemed quite daunting and difficult if I had just tried to do it myself. So I do believe we are stronger together. I think COVID, as I said, it did reveal what many of us in private practice knew very well, that it's a precarious and uncertain living. And so for me, what I want to change in the future is to look at ways to make the business more sustainable. And I'm mainly talking here about economic sustainability, although if we can also be environmentally and socially sustainable as well, that would be great. To become more robust, and mostly that's in terms of building reserves to be able to, overcome sudden financial strain such as the COVID imposed upon us, but also robust in capacity to adapt to change, to move quickly and in an efficient way as circumstances change. And more resilient, what it is that we need to be more resilient. Some of that may be a sort of personal resilient, but also a resilient business model. But also to really try to ensure the business can achieve its potential for growth, because I feel that there is potential here. And we are entering another period where people are being forced to leave permanent positions within the larger heritage organisations. And while the jobs might be lost, the people are not lost. The Conservators are not lost. They are going to move somewhere else. And we need to make sure that where that place is successful. So my business will carry on much as it's done before, providing the services it did before, offering work experience to students and graduates, contributing to research and being involved in professional activities. I've already mentioned Marina being on the committee. But the plan is to look at what more we could do. And as part of that process, as some of you heard from the ACR conference, I started a professional doctorate on a part-time basis, de-heritage at the University of Hertfordshire. And so I'm going to spend the next 5 years, in addition to running the business, carrying out research into my area of professional practice, that is private sector practice. And I'll be doing this as an independent, self-funded researcher. I've really felt that for quite a long time that the private sector has been left to its own devices in the main, and that this area of operation within our field, and the one in which many conservators across all disciplines make their living, is really quite poorly understood, and it's definitely underrepresented and underpromoted, and it's certainly inadequately supported. And while the situation has improved dramatically as a result of COVID, because of this light being shone on our situation, and it's really pleasing to hear and to know of the initiatives that have come about and are going to come up in the next few months, I still think that the contribution that the profession makes to the body of knowledge, to the training and development, the private sector, I mean, to training and development and the wider profile of the profession, the private sector doesn't really have the same visibility within the profession as museum conservation, let alone outside the profession. And for the 20 years that I've worked in the private sector, the profession has been aware that more and more conservators are entering private sector practice, but very little has changed in terms of how it takes account of that sector in policy and research and education. And I think that really has to change. We are in the middle of another wave of conservators moving into self-employment. So now really seems to be the time to explore what it needs to thrive, and also what more it has to offer the profession in terms of development and expansion and opportunity, and to other stakeholders, to the wider heritage sector. So just to finish on to say, I'm going to be reaching out to practitioners very soon via surveys, and I know we're maybe all getting a little tired of surveys, but mostly by interviews, one-to-one interviews and focus groups, to really gather qualitative data on the experiences, the insights, the ideas of private sector practitioners, and to combine the knowledge gained from hearing those narratives to what I've learned by looking at how other professions promote and support their private sector colleagues. Because I think everybody has something to gain from a healthy and expanding private sector. What I plan to do is to make my research findings public on a regular basis, and to really encourage others to participate in this effort to raise the profile, productivity and entrepreneurial potential of the private sector. I don't think it should be left to chance any longer. So I hope that my Textile Group colleagues are able to support me in that. Thank you.
Can I just remind everyone of the Q&A function? Please, if you have any questions for any of the committee, Icon, or any of the panelists, please put them into the Q&A box and we can answer them at the end of this session. Now we're going to have a slight shift in programme because Sara Crofts, Icon CEO, has to leave very shortly. So we are going to move on to hear from Sara Crofts, the CEO of Icon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. And more particularly, thank you for sharing your stories with everyone. It's been really interesting to hear about what people have been up to over the last year and what they think about the future. It's very valuable information. It helps us shape our policy and our activities. So I've been taking copious notes. I'm not going to dwell too much on the last year, other than to say that like many organisations, Icon did turn to the support that was offered by the government, and we too had a Culture Recovery Fund grant of moderate proportions. We secured £100,000, which is now all spent, and the biggest investment out of that was into our CRM, effectively the membership database that sits behind the website and looks after all of your membership information and helps us run the organisation. Although it probably doesn't sound like a big deal, actually that project has been transformative. It will continue to be transformative. I was thinking about it this morning and realised that in some ways it's a bit like being given the keys to a Lamborghini, having been driving a Ford Fiesta for the last 10 years. So it is quite a change for us as staff, and we're still very much learning to use it. But it will mean that we can capture, manage, learn from data much more effectively in the future than we have been able to do in the past. So that investment is going to support us over the coming years. And on that note, I do want to turn to the future and say a few things about what's coming up. I think the first thing I want to do is to draw your attention to this year's board election. We will be looking for some fresh trustees to join us at the AGM in October. And hopefully you've spotted that there is a new thing this year, which is that we have a reserved seat for an emerging professional, someone at the beginning of their conservation career. And that's a really exciting piece of work that's come about partly through the ongoing work of our Diversity and Inclusion Task and Finish group, which has been incredibly active, has put in a huge amount of effort, and will be sending a very chunky and interesting report to the board in September for the board to consider. So there's some interesting change happening, and do please consider standing for election, because the success of Icon is actually very much driven by us having a well-skilled, diverse and fully engaged board of trustees. One of the tasks of the board of trustees over the coming months, coming years, is going to be to really refocus our efforts on financial resilience. Like everyone else, we've taken a bit of a financial hit over the last year, not so much in sort of real cash terms, but more in terms of not being able to grow the membership in the way that we had hoped to do. So we will have to refocus on that because we know for certain that actually growing the membership, increasing the number of accredited members is very much key to our ongoing financial sustainability. But we will certainly be exploring other routes too, looking at fundraising, looking at other potential commercial options. There's nothing really kind of off the potential list, and all ideas are very much welcome if anyone has suggestions. And that work runs alongside an incredibly important strand of activity, which is the work that I'm currently doing to gather ideas, reflections, comments, all sorts of contributions towards what will become the Icon 2030 strategy. And every time I bump into conservators, heritage scientists, cultural heritage people more widely, I badger them with the question, what do you want the conservation profession to be in 2030? Whether you're in private practice, whether you're in a museum, whether you're in one of the related disciplines or doing something else entirely. It's really important that we hear from everyone about what the priorities should be, what activities we should focus on, and where we should put our effort. We're not a big organisation, we're not a big staff team, so we have to make those choices really, really carefully, but we need to know what people hope to achieve so that we have a framework to start from. So if you haven't had a look at the Padlet, please do have a look. If I don't get a chance to, we'll make sure you've got the link, but it is available in the IconNet newsletters on the website too. That's a place just to throw any ideas and inspiration that you have about what you see in the future. And I very much need the input of all the members and others in order to shape that in a way that's going to actually make a difference for us as an organisation and a profession. But turning very quickly back to some more immediate things that I just want to touch on. Conservation in Action is our sort of big advocacy campaign for the year, and it's a phrase you've probably heard others use. We're not claiming it's original, but it is very much based on a desire that we have to put conservation in the spotlight, to get it out from behind the scenes and to make sure that people see and value the work that's done in private practice and museums across the whole spectrum. And this is my plea to you all today for content for that campaign. I'd really like to tell some in-depth stories about projects that you're working on, about what life is like in studios, about the value that conservation brings to not just particular museums, but to wider society as well. So if you have any ideas about projects that we could feature or different types of content, do please let me or Gianina know. We've got quite a lot of hairs running at the moment, but all sorts of things are possible. If you give us a clue, we'll certainly try and follow things up. And that's probably about enough for me. I'm about to land our esteemed Chairman James in the soup, in that I'm about to dash off, because actually what I have to do is attend a DCMS meeting, which is all about heritage and its recovery post-COVID. So that's just a little indication that we carry on very much doing the policy work and trying to make sure that the needs of conservators are heard within civil service, within government. So I'm dashing off to do that soon, but I'm hoping that James might hang around, and that if you have questions that he might be able to answer them. But if not, if the committee would like to take some notes and forward them to me, I will happily answer them offline later if that's any help. So thank you for having me, and apologies for running off, but Whitehall does not necessarily wait, I'm afraid. Best wishes to everyone, and well done on another brilliant year, Textile Group. Top effort.
We're now going to have another slight switch of the programme, and we're moving on next to Karen Thompson, also of the Kelvin Centre for Conservation and Cultural Heritage Research.
You're muted, Karen. Karen.
I have realised, thank you very much. So I was saying thank you to everybody, and thank you for joining For us, very much it's been focused on teaching and how we adapt our teaching to the online environment. And I don't know whether any of you remember that when we met this time last year, we were shifting all our placements virtually. And they ran very successfully last year. So basically, conservation colleagues, students, and the teaching staff at the university worked tirelessly over the summer to run the virtual placements, and a huge amount of positive results came from that. And I think, but at the moment, I'm evaluating the work that we did during the placements. The students have written a blog, which you can see on our blog, about some of the sort of projects they did. But I think speaking to colleagues and students afterwards, there was a recognition and a need for getting in person and getting on and working with the objects was really important. But I think there's a huge amount of positive takeaways that we gained from the virtual placements. And a big message I think that's come through in some of the talks, you know, as Alison mentioned, is that the need and the value of collaboration. And some of the sort of things that we're doing this year is we've been having a lot more contact with colleagues that are hosting placements, and we now have a weekly drop-in where students and placement mentors can come with us and get together, and we can just chat, talk about the placements and just get together more casually, which is really nice. And we opened up the placement presentations to invite the placement hosts this year, which we'd never done before, and that was great. So we're hoping to continue it. I'm actually trying to work out the logistics of doing it live and online at the same time, so watch this space. So as I say, I'm sort of putting together the findings from the virtual placements, which I hope to publish later in the year, and I'll be able to share those results. But I think for us, we were very lucky that the university really saw the need and the value for us to continue our practical work in the studio. So whilst the more sort of theory-based lectures and the seminars were done online, all the practical work carried on as normal. So we were one of the few people in the university that were in, and we actually kept going throughout the whole of the year. So, and I think that was also, I think Scotland and I think Wales also similarly were able to do that, probably more so than England. So we've had a very successful year in the studios, but the university doesn't like to keep us sitting on our laurels. So they decided to relocate us also during the pandemic. So that added to our workload, and managing moving whilst social distancing was very challenging, I would say. But as always, the students worked really well with us, and we managed to do that very well. So we are now coming to the end of the year. We're closing up. The students are doing their dissertations. All of the students are out on placement. So everybody has had an in-person placement this year, and one of the students is also doing part of her placement virtually. So, so a really positive year actually in terms of teaching. And I think being able to come into the studio was actually made the year very manageable and a very positive year as well. I think in terms of working differently, we've been using online resources more and seeing the value of digital. It doesn't replace what we do, but it can add to what we do. So we're sort of, there are aspects that we'll be taking away and using as we move forward. But I think for us, it has been the networking and the collaboration and a lot more engagement with colleagues across the profession, which has been really rewarding and very positive. And I suppose for us, we've noticed a change in the demographic of the students that have applied for the programme. We're having more UK students. I don't think that's just COVID. I think that's possibly Brexit. So I think that will be interesting to see as we move forward. It's great to see that students are getting some opportunities, some short-term contracts, and hopefully more will develop as we move forward. But I think that's really it. So I'm very pleased also to be welcoming Jo, who has joined the team. So we've got some new ideas coming into the programme, and so we're very much looking forward to moving forward. So thank you very much.
Just a reminder again, if you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A for afterwards. We're going to now move on to our emerging professionals, Emma Smith and Beth Gillians.
So, hello, my name is Emma. I hope you can all see and hear me. And I'm a textile conservation intern at the Agm Stiftung in Switzerland. Last year, I spoke with Charlotte Cameron about the impact of COVID-19 on students and emerging professionals. Unfortunately, or fortunately, Charlotte is very busy with work, but I'm here to provide a short update. And then one of the current second year students is going to talk from the perspective of being on the textile course in Glasgow throughout the pandemic. So last year we spoke about the immediate impact of the pandemic and the disruption to our own internships, as well as more general difficulties for recent graduates, interns, and emerging professionals. We also spoke about our anxieties going forward and the ways that we hoped Icon and the profession would be able to help. What we really tried to highlight was how the pandemic has not only generated its own issues, but served to highlight existing issues, notably a lack of contracts, the prevalence of short-term contracts at low rates of pay. 1 year on from when we last spoke, the situation of finding work as an emerging professional seems more and more difficult. Sorry to bring the positivity down a little bit, but following the AGM, we emailed Icon with our comments and constructive suggestions of ways in which Icon could provide support and reassurance. This next bit I've reworded so many times, but essentially we found the response really disheartening. We didn't receive a positive response to implementing our suggestions. And we understand that Icon is a small team
They have been actively lobbying throughout the pandemic and generating support for the sector. However, often it feels as though this is carried out with no consultation with emerging professionals, and therefore it often falls short of the mark. So, as an example, the recently launched mentorship scheme for students does not include recent graduates who have been unable to find work in conservation. This group is most arguably in need of mentorship. As part of this email communication, we asked Icon to generate a survey to measure the impact of COVID on emerging professionals, which would aid in deciding where support was needed. Icon didn't feel they were able to take this on themselves, and we were asked to pursue this with the Emerging Professionals Network. Again, this created a feeling of emerging professionals not being a key concern within Icon, who were not able to dedicate time to listening to our needs. Instead, the onus being on the Emerging Professionals Network to collect data and really lobby Icon for support. So we spoke with the Emerging Professionals Network and worked with them to generate a survey of the impact of COVID on the wider emerging professionals community, which they have taken forward in the hope that a wider data set will highlight the need for increased support. So I'm going to read out an overview of this survey response from the Emerging Professionals Network, and then Beth is going to talk about the impact on current students. So firstly, I'll read out this report now from the EPN. Firstly, thank you to the Icon Textile Group who have asked us to contribute to their AGM tonight. We send our apologies that we couldn't attend this meeting in person to represent emerging professionals, but we hope that this will provide an overview into the work that we have been doing. Since the start of the pandemic, it has been a hugely challenging time for many emerging professionals. Even before COVID-19, many EPs faced multiple barriers upon entry to the conservation profession, which have since been exacerbated by the pandemic. To investigate these most pressing concerns, the Icon EPN released a survey in December 2020 to January 2021 to identify how the initial stages of the pandemic impacted emerging professionals. A full write-up of these results will be published in a forthcoming report, which they're currently working on to release. 162 people responded to the survey, ranging for those in full, part-time, internship, freelance and voluntary positions, as well as students and those seeking employment. Some of the main themes that were highlighted by the survey were, so when asked about the immediate impact of the pandemic, many people reported considerable disruption to their training, placements and internship opportunities and related support. A loss of income, reduced working hours, difficulty in finding work, uncertainty about prospects, and being placed on furlough with funding cuts and redundancy. Concerningly, a large proportion of people reported fearing a career change due to unstable job prospects made worse by the pandemic. Lack of practical experience and skills continues to be a major concern for emerging conservators, with many people reporting concerns that they will feel the impact of this lack of practical experience in their early training for years to come. When asked about why they anticipate a change in their career, some of the main reasons given included a lack of opportunity, increased competition for jobs, and the unsustainable nature of the profession. A complete change in career was also mentioned, with many respondents feeling that they now have no choice but to look outside of the field or leave it completely. Sentiment analysis, which we are testing as an additional analysis method for this data, has shown that fears are concentrated around jobs, including lack of available jobs, increased competition for jobs, and the insecure nature of contract jobs in the field. And we've just heard how many internships are delayed or have lost funding. Many people also cited the negative impact of the pandemic on their mental health. As anyone personally affected by the pandemic can attest, these results were not shocking. However, we feel that they are important data to give a voice to students and emerging conservators, and a valuable tool for understanding the future of conservation and how best to support its newest and prospective members. The conservation profession, like many aspects of life, has continued to change throughout 2021 and will continue to do so. Although these results are only representative of respondents' feelings at the end of 2020, start of 2021, we feel that they are important to look into the fears, hopes, and mindset of the next generation of conservators. And on a personal note, I just wanted to say that having been on the Icon Diversity and Inclusion Working Group for the last year and having done a lot of consultation with emerging professionals, these feelings are not changing, and in fact, I think they're worsening. The pandemic is not at its end, and the effects will be long-lasting for everyone in the heritage professions. We hope that by publishing these results, insight can be gained into the future by looking to the past. The Emerging Professional Network hopes to mobilise these results into tangible action for our members. Our long-term goals include future surveys and feedback to continue to understand both the changing conservation profession and the mindset of emerging professionals specifically within it. Please look out for our survey results in an upcoming issue of Icon News, and thank you for your interest in the future of conservation professionals. Feel free to get in touch with us at iconepn@gmail.com or through our Twitter and Facebook pages. We would love to connect with you. So that was the report from the Emerging Professional Network. Thank you for listening to me. I don't have much extra to say, and I'm going to hand over to Beth. So thanks.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everyone. As Emma said, I'm Beth Gillians, and I'm a final year student at what used to be known as the CTC, based at the University of Glasgow. I'd like to preface what I'm about to say by acknowledging that this is an incredibly difficult time and topic, which is hard to talk about in a public context for someone in a position like myself or Emma. I'm very conscious of the potential risk of getting the balance of this wrong, of seeming too negative and making a poor impression, remembering that many of you may be potential future employers. So I ask that you bear with us, as it's important that you understand the emerging professional perspective so that we can work to make sure conservation can be a viable career choice for all. As Karen has outlined, this has been an incredibly challenging time for the Centre and students. By the time we hand in our final work in August, my year group in particular will have spent 18 months of our 2-year MPhil in the shadow of a global pandemic. This time last year, we of course had to close the centre and we're all working from home. And our tutors were great and worked with us to ensure that as far as possible, we could continue to grow in the skills we need to function as emerging conservators. As much as we managed to make the best of it and come up with some really creative solutions, it would be dishonest of me to suggest that this was anything but incredibly difficult. We all sought desperately to advance at the same speed and to the same level as we would have done in more usual times, but did so in situations where we had little access to necessary resources, were under immense emotional pressure, and often had additional responsibilities or limitations on our time. As those of you familiar with this particular course will know, the summer between first and second year is when students carry out placements, gaining invaluable experience of working in the field that goes far beyond the practical. Although these placements were held, they were all virtual. In some cases, contact with placement hosts had to cease due to furlough restrictions, and being largely theoretical rather than practical, students were not able to gain the equivalent experience that they would have in other years. So now, having been doing hybrid online and in-person learning since this last September, we have, like the rest of the world, adapted quickly to the joys of Zoom, but no aspect of learning has been without its challenges. Things like the Scottish Government's restrictions, meaning we had very limited access to library resources, guest lecturers having to transition their hands-on sessions to online lectures, even the inability to build community between the 2-year groups because of social distancing restrictions. These things have really hindered our abilities to make the usual connections with all of you working in the field, or have the casual chats over a cup of tea, which is so often the inspiration for treatment epiphanies. One thing the students really wanted me to express is how grateful we are to all of our tutors for going above and beyond the call of duty, and to all of you who've gone out of your way to advise or teach, and as we understand how much you've had to put in to make it all work. For those of us completing this course in September, there's a great deal of trepidation. Only one of the 7 of us in my year group has been able to gain any in-person placement experience at all. When we complete the course, the majority of us cannot afford to self-fund voluntary placements. I know last year Emma and Charlotte did a fantastic job outlining some recommendations, and I think a year on they showed a lot of foresight and that these are worth building on. So The issues they raised were that there are few opportunities for emerging professionals, that these are often short contracts on a word-of-mouth basis, and don't meet Icon's salary requirements for entry-level conservators. Whilst there is always uncertainty about who will get work after graduating, it is worth noting that pretty consistently over recent years, there's been at least one graduate of every class who's been unable to get work in conservation, whilst others are working in low-paid temporary internships or short contract jobs. As highlighted by the survey, since the pandemic, there appear to be fewer of even these kind of opportunities than ever. Of last year's graduating class of 8 people, my understanding is that 3 have been unable to find work within conservation and 2 have had short-term contracts which are imminently ending. From this small pool, the situation for conservators looking for work within the UK seems worse than for those seeking work abroad. For my own year group, we are emerging into the field at a time when we know your funding has taken a large hit. We know redundancies are being made and where there is great competition for jobs already, and where we are at a disadvantage in terms of our practical experience. As it stands, I have seen one job advertised for which I am qualified at the end of this degree. No textile conservation internships have been advertised, though I'm pleased to hear that they will be forthcoming. That is in a year and a bit's time. Which is a great sign, but yeah, it would be great to have more clarity as to what the situation is, so it's good to hear that. Although Icon have released funding to support the gaining of missed work experience, even if application was successful, the £500 on offer by that funding is not enough to cover the equivalent living costs for placements, which usually would be 8 to 12 weeks. The second point made was that the pandemic would compound existing difficulties and make the field even more inaccessible to those who can't afford extra costs. To reiterate an overused pandemic illustration, whilst we are all in the same storm, we are not all in the same boat. This also presents major challenges in terms of interviews. Whilst lots of these have of course been online this last year, as different countries open up at different rates, some things are now starting to happen in person. The expectations around international travel for such things seems unrealistic in light of the immense costs and time investment necessary due to quarantine restrictions. At this point, I am urging you, if you are in a position where you interview candidates, this is a small international field, please continue to be supportive of online interviews and be aware of why they are more than a short-term necessity. Equally, these limitations have major impacts for gaining or renewing visas, and we need to remember these things. They may not be at the forefront of all of our minds, but they do have the capacity to determine an emerging professional's life choices. Finally, the emerging professionals and groups have been very active this last year, and that's been wonderful to see. But as valuable as soft sessions can be, what we need goes far beyond advice on how to be more marketable or how to improve your CV. It's also worth saying that the amount of online conferences and content generated over the course of the pandemic has been amazing, but also totally overwhelming. And we need to be aware, as has been mentioned before, that Zoom fatigue is real, especially when as students, we've spent a lot of the day often in online lectures. And there are so many other factors which may limit how much emerging professionals are able to engage with this content. We're still all trying to survive this pandemic, and we need to be wise with how much is reasonable to expect of ourselves and others. So to conclude, simply, we need more opportunities. We need to extend the Icon mentorship programme beyond just students, as Emma highlighted, and acknowledge the impact this pandemic has had on those early career professionals who have completed studies but haven't been able to break into conservation or attain stable employment. We need to link up with where institutions may be willing to take on early career professionals sooner rather than later, and or support funding applications for this. And we need longer term contracts. At present, without more support and more funding, conservation in the UK is at real risk of losing its trained emerging professionals. So thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you, Beth and Emma, for such an honest and revealing response. Our last contribution is going to be actually read by Elizabeth Ann Haldane on behalf of Deborah Phipps, a freelance textile conservator.
So unfortunately, Deborah couldn't be with us today, but that's because she's out on site working. So that is a good thing in a way. She says, first, thank you to the committee for asking me to talk about my lockdown life, and I apologise that I can't be with you in person. I currently work 2 to 3 days a week for Norfolk Museum Services, based, called NMS for short, based in Norwich, and 2 to 3 days a week freelance. My job for NMS is project-based short-term contracts that so far have run consecutively for just over 10 years. I work on exhibitions and loans. I provide training and advice throughout the whole service, and that's 10 sites. I do not have any time for core collections work. As a freelance conservator, I mostly work in London, and I have worked for private clients, large historic houses, and national institutions. Again, my work is project-based for specific timeframes, such as exhibitions and loans. The impact of the first lockdown on my freelance work last year was instant and shocking. All my planned work was cancelled with immediate effect, and it was several months before any contact was made over how to resolve the unfinished work. For the museum service, we were sent home with our recently updated laptops and told to work from home until further notice. Now, 16 months on, I look back and realise I was in shock. I've never been in the position of not having any work. I consider myself very fortunate in this, so not knowing if I would have any work in the future was a worrying thing. I worried that my NMS contract would not be renewed because as a bench-based conservator stuck at home, I was not fulfilling the terms of the contract. I worried that with no income from visitors, the large institutions wouldn't be able to hire in contractors anymore. I actually felt guilty for being at home from NMS with no work, as there's only so much computer work to be done if no objects are being worked on. We, the conservation team, returned to the NMS labs in September with many restrictions on numbers and plenty of sanitizer to hand, and we have been working since then. My contract has since been renewed, so generally I picked up where I left off. During the first lockdown, the 10 NMS sites were divided between the conservation team and visited on a weekly basis, visually checking the collections both on display and in the stores. Our environmental monitoring system is accessed remotely, so any issues were flagged, but unfortunately, no actions could be taken due to the very limited access. We are regrettably still catching up with issues now, including mold in the stores and pest infestations in the natural history display. As for keeping in contact with colleagues, at NMS, our fortnightly department meetings have moved online. This follows County Council guidelines about meetings and actually means we get through the agenda quicker, which is great. The wider conservation world, webinars, what a marvellous invention they are. I have attended more conferences and talks than ever before at a fraction of the cost, and so convenient to have the laptop near my workbench to listen while I work. Also, Instagram is full of conservators and conservation studios from all over the world, and it goes some way to satisfy my innate curiosity to see what other people are working on and thinking about. Going forward, over the next couple of years, I expect freelance work to be intermittent, while institutions recoup money they missed out on during lockdowns and restricted openings. I already see that exhibition schedules have been rearranged to push the more elaborate ones into the future, when hopefully more funds will be available. Freelance conservators who are happy with short-term contracts will always be used. I think it will be that there are fewer contracts available to more conservators. We know that most institutions have made redundancies over the past year or so, and those conservators still need to work. At NMS, there are many restrictions still in place, and most staff are still working from home with occasional visits on site. As a team, we are quite happy to have the building almost to ourselves. It is quieter and we have no interruptions or drop-in visitors. In fact, we are not currently allowed visitors unless we fill in risk assessments, produce safe systems of work documents, and apply for visitor permits. The County Council envisages these restrictions will stay in place until at least September this year. One small way the Textile Group can help is by continuing to arrange these conferences and talks online. So easy, so inclusive, and very welcome. thank you for your time, from Deborah Phipps.
That concludes all our contributions, and if all the contributors would like to turn their cameras on, we can now move on to questions. And in fact, we've only received one, and that's a question for Alison Lister about how she got what details there are about the recovery grants available.
So what I would say is just look through all the information that is coming out from all the organizations that are specifically set up for freelancers, for small businesses, for the creative and the cultural industries. And that's how you get to know about grants and deadlines in time to apply. And the Culture Recovery Grant for Heritage, I think it's about to enter a third round. So Icon got money from the first round, and the grant I applied for was in the second. And I think there's going to be a third, including money for organizations that didn't receive any money before, and possibly also further for support for ones that did. But there's also local, you might find your local council. Bristol Council has been really good about advertising funding. The universities in Bristol, which there are two, have a lot of kind of entrepreneurial development departments and individuals and support for small businesses. So I think you just want to really kind of connect with both the national level of funders and the local level. And it may just be a few £100s or a few £1,000s, but it really does make a difference. I think it makes a difference, not just in terms of the finances, but also, as I said, in terms of building your confidence that what you do is valued and valuable and has meaning, and that you can make that a convincing case for that financial support. And I think that's really important. So yes, but look up the Culture Recovery Grants for Heritage, because there is another round, I think, but also just everywhere and anywhere where you can find some financial support.
There's a comment from James Grierson in the chat box for anyone who's interested about CRF3. And we've got another question from Helen Hughes. Alison, I'm afraid it's aimed at you again, is should we be looking for leadership from the private sector conservators rather than institutions which are led by curators?
Ooh, that's a big question, I think we have to put ourselves out there. I think one of the reasons why perhaps the private sector is underrepresented is because we are not great about talking about ourselves, of promoting ourselves. And I think the consequences is that we've rather faded into the background. And I think in terms of the public perception of what we do, I sort of describe it that we were in this void somewhere behind the scenes at the museum, or the secrets of the National Trust, and the repair shop. And actually the private sector is somewhere in the middle. I'm in neither of those places. I'm in a rather boring industrial estate on the edge of Bristol. And I think the private sector needs to put itself out there, needs to show what it's made of and show what its potential is. And one of the things that's the strengths, I think, of the private sector is that we are inherently public facing. You know, I deal with owners and custodians of objects face to face on a daily basis, well, a bit less so now, and I think we are extremely good at presenting our expertise in many different ways and making a case for conservation being the right route for people to go down. So I think it's less about saying we should be leaders compared to others. I think it's about demonstrating our expertise, but if we can do that in a collaborative way with the curators or whoever else, then I think that's the better way of doing it. I do think if you look at the Museums Association Journal, for example, I don't think conservation appears quite as often as it should. I don't think we are necessarily connecting as much as we could with these other professionals. And many of them are freelancers and work for themselves. So I think we can perhaps connect in a different way as private practitioners. So I think it's less about leadership. I think it's about everybody making their strengths and potential obvious, and then looking for ways for everybody to build and succeed in partnership, I feel that would be the better way to go.
I think I'm just going to add a comment here as well as that what I've really noticed, and I've been lucky enough to work for institutions all my career, is the loss of curators. We have lost specialist textile curators across the board, and I think they were our support network in helping textiles to play a role in material culture. And if you haven't got your curators also adding their voice to the need for conservation, our voice is less able to be heard. And I'd also put in a plea for that. And I've had another question, which is, does anyone on the panel have any thoughts on how we can practically put into place making improvements for emerging professionals? Anyone want to start?
May I?
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I think the private sector is a great place to support an emerging professional, because we have this great diversity of work, very much focused on interventive, which is what one is doing in the early years, and lots of opportunities for learning and development and growing. But internships, and my studio is looking at internships, and we're looking at apprenticeships. The funding is an issue for the private sector, getting the funding to help the studios like mine support people in the early years development. And it's very much easier if you're in a public institution to access that funding. And I feel we're missing a trick here in terms of developing our profession as a whole, particularly our new entrants. And money is the key. And I think we have to find ways of finding the money to enable private sector practices to provide early years experience. And I really feel that would be really helpful and very productive for everybody.
Do we have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is, that's great to hear, Alison. That's something certainly Emma and I discussed in preparing for this, was the challenge of that. And, you know, we're not naive. We know there's no magic money tree. And we know that institutions are much more able to apply for grants where they exist than private conservators are. And that there are issues around having, you know, space even with social distancing. But I think as things like that ease up, we really need, where people are in positions where they might be able to consider that, to open themselves up to saying that they're able to take on people again. And, you know, we're not saying that it has to even necessarily be forever. But I think certainly my year are looking at this kind of bleak situation, for want of, you know, I don't want to be over dramatic, but still, you know, it's that point of, okay, well, I can independently contact private conservators and offer them free time. Well, I can't afford to live and eat if I do that. And actually museums are saying that they don't have enough space sometimes. So I think there really needs to be something done that this is considered a priority, and that somehow this situation, ideally Icon themselves, or there's got to be a way that we can find this situation, because otherwise I think we get down the road and there is a real drought at some point from the people that are in certainly the kind of 3 years, from when I graduate backwards. I'd say it is definitely an issue that needs addressing. I don't have a total solution, but I think certainly a combination of what Alison was saying and also the institutions having a think long and hard about what they can offer, or what they could consider suggesting that, you know, we can work on the grants or the funding with them.
Sorry to butt in again, but I've got a real thing about this, that I think actually we could also do it in partnership. So rather than the either or, you know, institutions or private, we could also have institutions and private and education, that it's a sort of combined, connected picture, because people move around the different sectors in their career and they bring something from their education and move through phases in their development. And so this sort of them or us, either or whatever, I think is not helpful. And actually maybe there's a better way, a sort of connected, interconnected way that can then sort of address all of those issues. But somebody has to make that happen. And for me, it's a huge amount of work that I cannot put into because it doesn't generate any income. But I would be very supportive of any effort in that direction.
Can I just ask some of the private sector conservators, where have you got money for internships from in the past? Can anyone share that?
Well, not from the private sector, but we have funded interns via American granting bodies, but that does limit who you can hire. We have had CRESS fellows. It's a fellowship opportunity for 1 year that can be extended to 2, but the person has to be North American, either Canadian or American. But that's what I would like to see, is that model. There's CRESS and Getty and Mellon fellowships all across the United States that are specifically for recent graduates. They're very competitive, but they are there. And there's probably, I don't know, 10 or a dozen a year across the disciplines. And it's tapping people like the cloth workers or the old girls who have more money than they know what to do with to start funding these things. I mean, the cloth workers are amazingly supportive of a lot of conservation issues, and maybe they need to be asked, could they support an internship system where you place people in different museums across the country. I mean, it's a competitive bidding process to get a CRESS application in. They have 25, 30 applicants for 8 or 10 fellowships every year. And it moves around. It moves from museum to museum and region to region.
And we've had a response from Zenzi, who says that she takes interns who do have funding in place to help with living expenses, and then her studio gives them their time and they work for nothing, which, you know, is one way. So do we have any other questions, or shall we look to wrap up? Although we could probably have James Grierson to address us all if Elizabeth Ann could make him a panelist.
I've done it, so hopefully that should work. Should be able to talk.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. I can't see myself, but you can obviously hear me. Well, I just want to say, I mean, it's been a completely, it's been in quite a sobering afternoon in some respects, but an absolutely fascinating set of contributions. And, you know, my sort of response to this is mixed. You know, I really do feel for the emerging professionals and students who happen to be hitting this particular terrible wave that coincides with a very critical time in, you know, the early part of their career, and that's very, very difficult. I'm reminded of it's a different sort of analogy, if you like, but I have been in my working life through 3 big recessions, and one of the things that's happened in the areas of work that I've been involved is that at each one of those recessions has been marked by a smaller cohort of people coming into the professions for a year or 2, and that's just, you know, that's what happens. Those cohorts then go on to find that the job market is a bit less crowded for them than others, and so it kind of seems to sort of work its way through. But that doesn't get away from the fact that the problems in the short term are very strenuous. I think there's something about the resilience and ingenuity. I mean, I think whenever I, listen to groups of conservators, I'm really struck by, just how resourceful you are as a group. And so I mentioned in the sort of the comment that we've got we'll shortly be opening up on the website a gallery for student work. So that's effectively a page or 2 per student stroke emerging professionals, member to sort of showcase some of their work, to act as a sort of shop window. It's a small thing, but it hopefully will be a useful thing. As Sara mentioned, it's not a big organisation, and we have to cover a lot of bases, and beyond keeping the organisation running and the services being provided and things, there is a significant amount of effort that goes into lobbying. One of the things that I think is a challenge and something to be aware of. I have another role, which is I chair a museums trust, and so looking at some of the decisions that get made in institutions from a different viewpoint. So much of the funding environment is basically a conversation now about audiences and communities. And it becomes quite difficult, I think, to sustain the interest of the funding bodies in discussions about collections and buildings and that kind of thing. So I think it's a really important job that collectively we've all got to find a way of getting better at, which is making the connection between conservation and communities and audiences more sort of natural, more explicit. Otherwise, the report that Emma referred to, the piece of work that Emma referred to, which you felt hadn't received a sort of as full a response or as good a response as you'd like, and I'm really sorry about that. I don't actually know what piece of work we're talking about. I certainly haven't seen it, and I would like to do so. And I would like to, to keep on listening to some of the work that comes out of the, the further survey programs and so on. But an interesting and sobering afternoon in many respects. And as Sara said, and I've also been, I've got 2 pages of notes here, and it's been incredibly useful from that point of view. Thank you for inviting me to be with you.
Thank you, James. And I'm now just going to hand over to Ksenia to wrap up the afternoon.
Thank you, Anne. Well, I'm lost for words, really. Those last talks were very sobering, and the funding issue is going to be with us for a while. But I really want to thank all the speakers this afternoon for sharing their experiences that they've had over the last year. It's been really interesting. And I have to say that from the things that I've read in conservation news and elsewhere, and what I've heard and witnessed both virtually and in person, conservators have proved themselves to be both innovative and resourceful. And I'm sure will continue to be so. And the networking and support that we can give each other is really vital. And on behalf of everyone, I do want to say a very, very special thank you to our group committee, those who are staying on and those who are departing, for all your hard work and enthusiasm, especially over the past 18 months. It's been incredible. The organisation of online presentations and then the Spring Forum, held jointly with the Historic Interiors Group, have been a triumph, and you should be really proud of what you've achieved through these difficult times. And all this experience will be invaluable and help inform what we do next. So well done, everyone. I give you a big clap for that. I'm very pleased to have been given the opportunity of taking on the role of chair of the group, and I look forward to getting to know the rest of the committee and to hearing about current plans for future events. Anne and I will be meeting up in a couple of weeks' time by way of a handover, and I believe, Anne, you've got a stack of papers for me. Michael Nellis, head of membership for Icon, has been in touch with me already, and we are arranging to meet to discuss any questions I might have about the support available from the Icon office for group activities. I will also be meeting up with other group chairs later in the year, and will be attending the Icon Strategy 2030 Zoom workshop next week to discuss the future of the conservation profession and to see how we can help shape Icon's strategy for the next 10 years. So I have a bit of catching up to do, and I look forward to sharing all this relevant information with you as it becomes available. My first job, though, is to get to know the committee and learn about what ideas they may have. And if any members have suggestions or wish to offer an online talk or workshop, then please do get in touch, as Maria has said earlier. So in the meantime, thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone, and use your many skills to slowly adapt to a slightly different way of life that in itself will become the new normal. Thank you. Back to you, Anne, or I don't know what happens next.
I think that closes our AGM and forum. So we'll leave the webinar, and thank you all to everybody. It's been an amazing set of contributions.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.